Hey everyone, welcome. This video is going to start talking about fonts and font families because one of the first things that we do when we're tackling styles for our website is to look at our font styles. And font styles can include anything like typeface or size or weight or style. But we have to be aware that when we're setting up our fonts, not every browser recognizes every single font that exists. So we use a font family property with a stack of fonts, because we don't have complete control over which font our browser is going to be able to display, but we do have control over the priority order in which we set them. So notice here in my paragraph selector, I have the font family property, and I've listed out 3 separate fonts that I would like for my browser to render this paragraph with. Now first, the browser is going to attempt to render any text that we have out there in this big Caslon font. Now if that one isn't available, it's going to move on to the next one, Palatino. And if that one's not available, it's going to look for any serif font or the default serif font for that particular browser. So let's start by talking about what are the font families. Well, we have a total of 5 generic font families that we can choose from. There's serif, sans-serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. Let's start by talking about the serif font. Serifs have these little extra decorative appendages or ligatures that are on the letters. These little extra spaces, they're called serifs. And because serifs are on most of those letters, it makes it really great for large text like headings, or for long passages of text like large paragraphs or big pieces of content. Here's some examples of serif fonts: Times New Roman, Dido, Palatino, and Baskerville. The second font family I'm going to talk about is sans-serif. Literally, the word sans means without. So in this case, we're talking about without serifs, meaning these letters don't have those little ligatures or those little decorative appendages. We're looking at straight letter strokes. Some of the more popular sans-serif fonts that are in existence today are Arial, Geneva, or Optima. And just like sans-serif, the serif font works really great for large text like headings. It also works well for long passages of text, large paragraphs, big pieces of content, for example. A benefit to serif fonts over sans-serif fonts is that some folks will say they like to avoid the sans-serif font or without serif font because it's a little bit harder to read when the font is smaller. Now the third font family I'll cover is called Monospace. Now with Monospace, each letter character takes up the exact same amount of space. So a capital M, for instance, is going to be just as wide as a lowercase letter I. We use these fonts a lot for code readouts because they distinctly look a lot different from the other fonts that are on our page. And there's many times where having the Monospace font using a fixed width is beneficial. Because it's equally sized and spaced for all of the individual strokes in the Monospace font, it's considered practical and very easy to read. Now the next font in the font family is called Cursive. Cursive is like a font that would emulate a handwritten script. Generally these are really thin, very decorative or ornate letters, and they're sort of meant to replicate a fancy handwritten style. We typically use cursive fonts for really short pieces of text or for headings, anything that needs to be displayed in a larger size and set aside or set off from the rest of the font in our workspace. And because they're very distinct, they're meant to call attention to themselves. Now the final generic font family is the fantasy font. These are the fonts that are a little bit different and they really don't fall into any other category. We don't use these as often. There isn't a whole lot of extensive support across different browsers, and they're really challenging to read if we use a lot of it. We don't want to use fantasy fonts for body content because it's really taxing on the eye when we see so much of this decorative font being used. You might see that in logos or maybe book or movie titles that are just designed to be hard to forget but impactful. Some common ones are chalk duster, marker felt, and copperplate. So when it comes to our font stacks, the best thing to do is to specify these fonts starting with what your first choice is for that particular item. And you want to provide some similar alternatives just in case that first option isn't available. Those fallback positions are going to be your second and third choices in the event that the first one can't be used. But at the end of our font stack, we then want to end with the generic font family just in case nothing else is available. The browser's going to at least get us in the right stylistic ballpark when it comes to applying that font to our different elements. And keep in mind, this doesn't necessarily mean that the browser doesn't have or support that particular font. It could also mean that the end user doesn't have that particular font available on their computer or on their device. So it definitely needs to end with something generic to account for any of those possibilities. Let's say, for example, you wanted an upright sans-serif font. You might start with your favorite font, let's say Geneva, and then you'll list a few more that are more common. Helvetica is the default one for Chrome, so maybe you would put that in there too somewhere, but you could also have Verdana or Gil Sans. And now there's no limit to the number of fonts that you can include, but most designers try to keep it under 10. Somewhere between 5 and 6 fonts in our font stack is pretty typical. And a good font stack is going to include stylistically related fonts that are installed on most computers. Check out this really cool link for common font stacks on the W3 schools. I'll make sure to include that in our lecture notes. But let's actually do some demonstrations. Now I've already downloaded the Week 8 demo from Blackboard Part 1, and I've got it in VS Code. I'm going to go ahead and open up the menu.css file inside of our Style Sheets folder, and I'll also open up the HTML file and the preview pane. Now I want to add a style to our body element and set the property of the font family to the value of Verdana and Sans-Serif. Now before I save, notice how in my preview all of my letters are using this serif font. Again, they have those little decorative appendages or slabs or ligature marks, whatever you'd like to refer to them as. Each one has that little extra mark. I'm going to go ahead and save my changes. And notice how each one of those appendages is missing. This is our sans-serif font. Now because of inheritance, this font property cascaded down through our document object model and applied the font to every text element. Whether or not we were able to render Verdana didn't matter because we did have a sans-serif specified as our generic fallback. Let's try choosing a serif font to apply to our H1 element. I'll use Times New Roman, Times, and serif. And I'll save my changes. Notice how I now have a serif H1 font. Whether or not it applied Times New Roman or Times, it's okay because if it didn't have those available, it still applied our generic font family of serif. And that's a quick overview of fonts and font families. Now if you have any questions on this, please don't hesitate to ask.